Hello and welcome to the program. My name is Luke Hunt and this is another podcast for The Diplomat. And with me today is Abby Safe. Abby is a long-term correspondent in Southeast Asia, spent a lot of time in Cambodia, and she's just released a book, Troubling the Water, A Dying Lake and a Vanishing World in Cambodia. Abby, welcome to the program.
Hi Luke, thank you for having me.
It's a terrific read and I really like the way you've kind of interwoven the history of the Mekong going back 1,000 years and brought it right up to the present day and the problems that fishermen are experiencing with the river and all the issues that are confronting it, climate change, dams. How do you see the river now going forward? And it's quite a pessimistic outlook. Are things that bad? Do you think there's no way back?
You know, most of the on-the-ground reporting on this book took place in 2016 and 2017, a bit in 2018. 2016 was a drought year, and it was, at the time, you know, the worst on record, the lowest water level, the lowest fish catch, these devastating forest fires just ripped across the lake. And that was the worst anyone had seen. But what we've seen since 2016, so over the last 6 years, I suppose,
yes,
is that except for 2017, every year has hit a new record low in the Mekong and then in the Tonle Sap. And that's something, you know, when I was reporting it, I knew it was bad and I didn't think things would get markedly better, but I also sort of didn't expect such a quick decline as what we've seen.
Mm-hmm.
And I think it really speaks to the sort of unique trifecta that the lake is facing. So you've got climate change, you've got these hydropower dams, and you've got overfishing and illegal fishing. And nothing, you know, since 2016, those situations have only worsened. We've had another dam come online, which is the Lower Saison 2. That's a tributary dam, but that has really major impacts downstream. We've had, you know, globally the hottest years on record, year after year, and just more illegal fishing, more overcrowding. So in terms of the situation, sort of since I wrote the book and looking forward, to me it is pretty grim, and I don't want to say it's hopeless. You know, I think there are some signs that the government is taking this seriously. There's signs that China recognizes the impact of upstream dams and is working more with lower Mekong countries to release the water when needed. But climate change, that's really a global issue, and we're soon all going to see the results of that. I mean, you're in Australia, so you're seeing the impacts as well.
Indeed. The MRC, the Mekong River Commission, seems to be finding, I wouldn't say teeth, because it hasn't been very strong in its ability to achieve anything except maybe get people to talk. But there has been releasing a series of statements over the last 3 or 4 months, and each one is getting kind of more and more confronting the realities of the plight of the river. Are you seeing that as well? Do you think, just mentioned China, that there is this growing realization, as late as that might be, but there does seem to be this acceptance that, like, oh dear, we may have gone too far on this?
Yeah, I think that's a good point. I would completely agree with your characterization. The thing to understand about the MRC is they are not a binding body and they are not an enforcement body. And this is the problem that has sort of plagued them all along. They're an intergovernmental body that kind of tries to work with all of the lower Mekong countries, but you'll have something like all of the lower Mekong countries agree no main stem dams on the Mekong, and then Laos will go ahead and build the Xayaburi.
Yep.
So this has always been an issue for the MRC. We definitely are, you know, the MRC, I agree, is becoming stronger. There's a new head. He gave a speech last month, and it does not mince words about what catastrophe is sort of awaiting the river and the 70 million people who depend on it. I wouldn't say this is so new for the MRC. They had a terrific council report maybe 4 or 5 years ago where they did really in-depth modeling of sort of the cost and benefit of all the hydro dams in every iteration. If every dam was built, if only a portion of the proposed dams were built, and then also looking at climate change, if climate change is at its worst, if it's at its not worst, and kind of even in the best case scenario, downstream countries like Cambodia and Vietnam, we're just going to see billions and billions and billions of dollars in losses of wetlands and losses of fisheries and losses of paddy land, and then of course in the Vietnam Delta. And what was interesting about that report is Cambodia was always going to be the hardest hit because unlike Vietnam, the country just kind of doesn't have the resources to offset these losses. So the MRC is not unaware of this problem. The bigger issue is, the MRC is only as good as the governments. And we see a real mixed bag in terms of what governments are willing to do, whether they, will follow their word and really come together and work on these Mekong issues. I don't know. I'm not, I do think it's a good sign if you have this body that's stronger and stronger. But again, it's not an enforcement body, and it's not a body with teeth, and that's not its fault. That's just kind of how the body is set up.
Right. When it comes to the funding of these dams, and I'm thinking of the World Bank, Asian Development Bank, ADB, these sorts of institutions, they've always been very quiet about their funding. They gave the go-ahead for a lot of these dams. Do you think they have a case to answer? Particularly going forward. I mean, these institutions have been great at ploughing money into small, impoverished countries where the elites have they've done quite well out of it. But the destruction that's been wrought a generation, not even a generation later, do you think they need to do a rethink and come forward with changing policies about what happens next?
Yeah, gosh, I have to admit this is not something I know about in detail, but there's an excellent book that came out a few years ago about a World Bank funded dam in Laos, not a Mekong main stem dam, but a major dam that just devastated the local community. We see this all across the region. These huge infrastructure projects come in. There's very little oversight. I think you probably remember in Phnom Penh there was a similar one with the land titling program. Is it up on
Yes, I do. Yeah.
And so these banks, they do have their mechanisms for complaints and for, ostensibly for restitution, but it's a arduous process. It takes years.
Right.
And they very rarely result in anything. And by that, when you're, it's one thing if you're talking about a land or a resettlement as devastating as there is, maybe there's a chance for kind of delayed justice. When you're talking about a dam reservoir that destroys a village and changes the hydrology and impacts fish migration, there's kind of no undoing that. So in the case of most of these dams, I don't think they're funded by any of those big banks, but in the case of sort of many development projects, there's, at a global level, there's a lot they have to answer for.
Now, you mentioned the complaints process and how difficult that is. Now, if people like yourself would struggle in knowing where to go, how to get restitution, how to fill out the complaint form, where do you start? I mean, if Western educated people who have an understanding of these banks and the way they work have trouble accessing that kind of level within these bureaucracies, how would the people that you've been interviewing for your book go about it? I mean, I would imagine it'd be almost impossible. Most of these people, the fishermen and their families, they don't have much of an education. They live in their own bubbles, which is basically on their boats on the Mekong River. Their fish catches have gone from 20 to 30 kilos down to 2 or 3 kilos. As one fisherman once told me, he catches barely enough to feed the village cat. How can these people possibly go about finding some form of compensation for their losses?
Yeah, I mean, generally when there are cases brought against the banks, it's done by NGOs that focus specifically on this, and they sort of find it's more them becoming aware of a case, and that becomes a test case for them. It's or occasionally, a community is working with an NGO that is aware of this and then takes it up. It's I've never heard of it being an individual. But one thing I want to be clear about is specifically in the case of the Tonle Sap and the Lower Mekong, I don't think any of those dams we're talking about are funded by these banks. They're funded, they're mostly funded by Chinese companies, which are state-owned enterprise, and so there's even less transparency there, even fewer accountability mechanisms, which also makes it, doubly difficult. There's not really, as weak as that resource is with something like World Bank or ADB, becomes that much weaker when you're talking about, fairly opaque structures of ownership and governance.
Right. In your book, you must have spoken to, I don't know about hundreds, but perhaps 100 over the years of fishermen and their reaction to basically standing back and watching their livelihoods disappear. Who were your favourites? Who do you think summed up best the plight of the Mekong River? Who were your favourites?
Gosh, there really were a lot of interesting people. What was nice and sort of a pity in terms of long term was I was able to repeatedly visit a few people, but not as repeatedly as I had hoped. I hoped I would be able to go back, and then the pandemic occurred. But the woman I started the book with, Chang Lom, I started with her because she was great. We showed up at her house in 2016. She lives in this area of Praktol where, forest fires were still burning in the distance when we were visiting. But she had sort of already replanted her garden, and she was quite elderly, and she was just pushing ahead with her life. And, I think like many Khmer Rouge survivors, she sort of was this very strong, resilient woman who just, would kind of took this terrible situation and just wanted to move forward and wanted to do the best she could. And then when I visited her a year later, I remember really clearly her sort of showing us around the garden, but then pointing out things that weren't growing the way they should and saying, do you think something's wrong with the soil? Do you have any ideas? And I was just very struck by her because to me, she encapsulated the situation facing so many people, which is they are really trying, It's not like things are getting tough and they're sort of giving up. They are doing everything that they can to eke out a living, to eke out a livelihood. But the forces they're fighting up against are just so difficult and so kind of beyond the pale.
I thought you nailed it quite well in that there's a lot of factors impacting on the Mekong River. You mentioned the ease with which Khmers blame the Vietnamese and the Yuan, for want of a better term, which is highly derogatory in some quarters. The use of illegal fishing nets. There's also other issues too, like sand dredging. Where do you start and where do you finish in terms of dealing with these problems? Like the MRC tends to deal more so now with dams and climate change, but there are all these other issues afflicting the river, and there doesn't seem to be one body, there doesn't seem to be one government institution that's capable of managing the river itself within, say, Cambodia, within Vietnam. It seems to be kicking the can from one country to another.
Sure. I mean, what I would say and what I kind of talk about in the book is there is a lot that could be done sort of immediately to help the situation in the lake a lot, even if you couldn't fix the hydrology, and even if you can't do anything about climate change, things could be done to stop overfishing and illegal fishing. And unfortunately what we're seeing is a really blunt instrument. So for instance, in the last few months there's been a real crackdown on illegal fishing in the Tonle Sap, and a crackdown on illegal use of farmland, cutting down the flooded forest around the Tonle Sap. And that's great, that's important, but we need to ask who this crackdown is affecting and how it's being implemented, because typically these crackdowns, they really go after the sort of smallest people, the most vulnerable people. They're not going after the big illegal offenders. They're not going after corrupt officials that are allowing large-scale illegal fishing to happen. And sort of unless there's a real anti-corruption drive, I don't see these problems stopping. The people who are illegal fishing, who are small-scale fishers, they're doing this out of pure desperation. This is not greed. This is, if I don't use a net with a smaller hole, I can't pull in a single fish. If I don't take, a little bit of wood from the flooded forest, I can't create a fish trap. This is real desperation that we're seeing on the lake. So is there a way to address that? I recognize Cambodia is a very poor country, but are there ways to give people alternative vocational opportunities? Is there a way to move some of them to the land, which might not help? The situation facing farmers is not great either. But anything that can give them a bit of money or a bit of security in a way that could help the fish stocks would be a major help. But again, if you're only going after the small people and large-scale illegal fishing is quietly continuing, nothing's going to, this is not going to save the lake and its fisheries either. So to that end, I do think there are real concrete things that can be done, even if MRC countries can't get it together, even if China, can't release enough water. Mm-hmm. There are on-the-ground things that could be done and should be done.
Yeah, last 3 or 4 weeks, there were a flurry of press releases coming out of the government touting how successful their crackdown, which was ordered by Hun Sen, the crackdown on illegal fishing. And the lines were, I'll get in trouble for saying it, but I thought they were rather pathetic. It's like, we have arrested 32 fishermen and seized 12 boats, and along with these photographs of people and their families who are obviously impoverished, who obviously had nowhere else to go and are simply doing what they've always done. And this just doesn't seem to be addressing the problem at all, which are the bigger scale fishermen and the people who are paying bribes to get more so at a local level than at the higher tier. But it's not addressing the real issue, which brings me to another point. How important are fish ponds, cultivating fish in the river? In your book, you mentioned this quite a bit, and I can't see that being an answer, perhaps a short-term substitute, but cultivating fish in ponds does not seem to be a longer-term solution. And I think, as you said, it's almost an acceptance that the traditional days of the mighty Mekong are over.
Yeah, it's hard to know about fish cultivation. What's interesting is when you look at the yields now, they're about identical. It's around 500,000 tons pulled from the freshwater fisheries in Cambodia, and it's around 500,000 tons pulled from the fish ponds, which is at 10 or 20-fold from just a decade ago. Mm-hmm. So fish ponds are being utilized in a big way, and I suspect that will only continue to grow. From a food security standpoint, fish is fish. Of course, there are concerns if chemicals are being used, but from that perspective, I do think it's valid to use this to offset the diminishing natural fisheries, but it cannot offset the diminishing livelihood, because it's an investment to start up a fish pond.
Exactly.
It's not something that your average fisherman can afford. And these fishing families, as you point out, are, they're really living hand to mouth. And before, it wasn't like it was a lucrative livelihood, but they could catch enough to feed themselves and also likely make a small living. A fish pond is not something that's open to everyone. So what we see is more and more people leaving the lake, more and more migration. And I have heard kind of anecdotally that with this latest crackdown, there's just been a huge rise in people, getting travel documents and going to Thailand again. So
right.
It just seems like a very vicious cycle to me at the moment.
Well, I guess what I'm driving at, and you touched on that, is to start up a fish pond and cultivate fish, as in farming fish. It's a middle class business, and this can only further squeeze out the traditional fishermen and how they've been living their lives, and they have very few alternatives. I've covered, well, I've forgotten how many years, but I'm sure you're aware of the Cham families living on the living at the back of the peninsula in Phnom Penh. Now, I remember interviewing them. We did a television production on them about 3 or 4 years ago, and it was about my third trip out, and they had been promised 5 years earlier that they would be given land, that their families can move away from the Mekong where their livelihoods were desperately poor, and their children will be able to go to school. And and it's happening now with we've got commune elections coming up and elections again next year, the national elections. But a lot of these people are continually being promised, yes, we'll give you land, yes, we'll give your children access to schools, just wait until after the next election, which is, basically thumping them down. Be a good boy, do as you're told, and we'll give you what you want. But a lot of people, this just simply hasn't been delivered. There are a lot of broken promises out there.
Yeah, that's exactly right. I mean, for the book, I spoke to one gentleman, Mokian, who's in his 70s and lives in a very tiny floating village. By floating village, I mean boats and houseboats on the water, not stilted homes. So these are really, the poorest of the poor. There's no land for them. And I was speaking to him in 2016 and 2017, just before the elections, and he was telling me, they've said they're going to give us that land over there. If we vote for CPP, we'll get that land. And I was speaking to people in other villages who, similarly had been petitioning the government for years for land. And, oh, yes, we'll get that for you. We'll get that for you. And, yeah, it's one of the sort of oldest election promises. We'll get you what you ask for and vote for us.
Right.
Yeah, there's not, they just, what's sort of the main point is they just do not have other options. They're completely stuck there unless they have some kind of assistance, or unless through some magic of thrift they've managed to get a small plot of land. We can be very nostalgic about fishing and a loss of livelihood and a loss of culture and a loss of, something that people have been doing for generations. Most fishing families are just practical about it. They want to get by like anyone. They want their kids to be able to go to school. They want them to have opportunities that they don't have, and fishing is not the way. Instead, it's just causing, more and more devastation and cycles of debt and cycles of poverty.
Sure.
Mass migration.
It's probably a little outside your remit, but I'll ask anyway. There've been quite a few analysts on the security side of life who have been forecasting that the lower Mekong River Basin could be ripe for civil unrest. I know Greg Barton at Deakin University, who's a counter-terrorist special, has the Mekong River ranked quite highly as potential threats going forward if they don't get it right. You're on the ground. You've interviewed these people. Do you think that civil unrest is a potential going forward?
Well, I should say I haven't been back to Cambodia for a few years, so I'm not on the ground. I don't want to portray myself inaccurately.
Sure, but I don't think anyone would argue it's improved.
I actually came to this initially from a security standpoint. The first time I wanted to report on this, I went to I sort of applied to go to this workshop about security issues. And I was thinking about this as a security issue. But if I'm perfectly frank, I don't know if I see that. I think we see so many people who are in very, very desperate states, who are starving, who are deep in debt, whose kids are leaving home. And I don't see people grabbing arms and hitting the streets. And I think that's because these countries are really perfected their autocratic states. All of these lower Mekong countries, in some level or another, are fairly autocratic.
They don't like critics.
Military junta in Thailand. You You have a hardcore, very sort of powerful, long-standing government in Vietnam and Cambodia, and in Laos, the situation is so opaque. No one knows what the hell is going on there. And I think sadly, like worldwide, humans just have to deal with a lot of misery. And I'm not saying that uprisings don't happen and that there's not very many brave people fighting this stuff. Even within Cambodia, there's amazing environmental activists who are fighting this stuff and are going to jail for it. But at the end of the day, I feel that the leaders of these countries really have people under their thumb in a way that prevents unrest. But perhaps I'm incorrect. Perhaps people start starving to such a degree that there is, I don't know. I think if I could just add something.
Sure.
I think what we tend to see, and we're already seeing this globally, is climate crises push people out. So every time we call someone an economic migrant in our disgusting parlance, they are almost always a victim of, in this day and age, a victim of some catastrophe, and more frequently of a climate catastrophe. Yeah. So, they're not able to grow the things at home they once were. Their farms are not working properly. There are no opportunities in their countries, and they have to leave. And the temperatures are getting higher and higher. There's less and less food. We're seeing this across Africa. We're seeing this across Asia. We're seeing this everywhere. And it's not, when we say unrest, I think the unrest we don't talk about is like the human unrest, the having to leave your land and your culture and your life just to seek sustenance.
I remember sort of 20 years ago, it was not unusual to see fishermen, farmers, people who were having a bad year, bad crops, petitioning the king in Phnom Penh. We don't see that anymore, but if we look at the protest that dominated, say, in 2010s up until about 2017 when the crackdown really hit, that a lot of those protests were, it was the youth. They were educated, they had motorbikes, they wanted change, kind of very aspirational middle class almost. And that's not the type of people we're talking about. It's a dreadful condition when these people no longer have an avenue. They no longer go to Phnom Penh to petition the king. It's kind of like they've just been bullied into a sort of submission, whereas you're saying that the best they can do is pack up and leave and just go somewhere else.
I mean, I think we do see, these small things where people try to go to their provincial office and try to petition. I've certainly seen that following the local news in terms of land disputes, which is what we've seen all along. But you're completely right. We haven't. It's been years since there's been that type of large scale protest.
Right.
Often people ask if it's completely hopeless, and I talk about, well, if Mekong nations could do this, or if China could do this, or if local officials could do this. But I would say another reason why I don't think it's completely hopeless is I see many Cambodians on the ground who really care about these issues. You see this great groundswell among young people in particular who really are passionate about the environment and are at great risk to themselves, kind of raising these issues and asking these questions and pushing. We've seen a number of environmental activists arrested in recent years, but there's still many young people who are discussing these issues openly. And so to me, that is a reason for hope. You have to believe that this generation that is really fighting to better things, it's really inspiring. So I would like to end with that, perhaps.
That's fine. Abby Saif, good luck with the book. It's a terrific read, and thank you very much.
Thank you so much for having me, Luke. This has been great.